Welcome to the USC Rossier Leadership Month in today's webinar, Removing Racism from Our Campus Communities. Before we begin, I would like to review the process for submitting a question for our panelists. Please type your question in the Q&A box that can be accessed by clicking the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. We have reserved time towards the end of the webinar for your questions and hope to get it to as many as possible. We also received a number of questions in advance via the registration form and have tried to incorporate as many of them as possible into our structured Q&A at the beginning of the session. If you are planning to share your experience today on today's session on social media, we encourage you to include the Leadership Month hashtag Rossier Leads, which appears at the top of the screen. Lastly, please note a recording of this webinar will be available in the next few days and a link will be sent via email. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, Darline Robles. Darlene Robles earned her PhD from USC in 1993 and currently serves as the Professor of Clinical Education and the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion at USC Rossier. At this point, I will turn the program over to you, Darlene.
Thank you, Kanae. And I also want to thank everyone who chose to attend this leadership seminar on removing racism from our campus community, an important topic that all of us are addressing at our own universities and professional organizations. It is truly an honor to be with an esteemed group of panelists today, so I would like to introduce them. First is Darnell Cole, who's the co-director of the Center for Education, Identity, and Social Justice, and Associate Professor of Education at USC Rossier School of Education. I'm so honored to call him a colleague of mine. Welcome, Darnell. Next, I want to introduce Bruce Smith, who is a Rossier graduate from the MS program in 1998, and he's Vice President, Dean of Students at Whittier College. Welcome, Bruce. Next, Michele Turner, who received her BS in '81 and her doctorate from our Rossier School Global Executive, a fellow Trojan, and who is currently the Executive Director of USC Black Alumni Association. Welcome, Michele. And as you can see by my brief bio introduction of each one, they bring a wealth of professional and personal experience on this important topic that we're going to discuss today. Over the last several weeks, we've seen such a deep commitment to wanting to disrupt anti-Blackness and racism in our communities, as evidenced by the surge in activism and demonstrations calling attention to something that stems far beyond what we need to do, and the absolute appearance and vocal voices of Black Lives Matters. But we know that this movement and this moment that we're in, we have to move forward to really look at the critical efforts that are needed to eradicate all forms of racism on our campuses. So our panelists are going to provide their insights and perspectives on how we get to do this as individuals and as organizations. I will ask each panelist a specific question, and then we'll open up for 3 additional questions which everyone will respond to. So I'm going to start with Michele. Michele, in recent weeks, on Instagram account, the Black USC, it has had over 500 posts, I think close to 1,000 now when I looked at it recently, from students, alumni, faculty, and staff sharing their experiences with racism within the USC community, on how heartful and sad it was to read many of those posts from our own students and faculty and alum. How can a platform like this help move forward the conversation needed to remove racism on a campus like USC?
Thank you, Darlene. That really is such a packed question because frankly, you know, we're in an age where technology is allowing many voices in many platforms. And you're right, there are students, there are faculty, there are alumni, you know, showing up in the Instagram world. And there are a lot of different kinds of voices in that space as well. They're not just all monolithic voices. Most of them, yes, are negative, and then there are other supportive voices as well. But you know, it's one thing to read the Instagram or platforms like this to get a better sense of what the frustration is. or wherever you need to go to get a better sense of what the frustration is. But the reality is, you know, as we take this acknowledgement of this frustration and we bring it back into our campus models, you know, the difficulty is in understanding what the policy frameworks actually are within institutions, and institutions like USC, which are predominantly white institutions, and they have policy frameworks that are not multicultural frameworks. You know, so what do you do with these multicultural voices in really lifting up advocacy and trying to change systems and trying to bridge that into policy frameworks, which really have demanded assimilation, you know, which are very Eurocentric, you know, not just in their historical traditions, but the way they judge intellect. So this gap right here is the work, and we can inform this work from experience, which you're seeing in the IG, as well as research, which Darnell and Bruce and some research also that I've done, and then many others. But the answer is in this gap.
Thank you, Michele. And we'll talk more about going to depth and some other questions as well. So thank you for that, Michele. Bruce, college campuses appear committed to moving racism from their communities. There has not been a lack of formal statements, announcements stating their, you know, supportive of the Black Lives Matter, supportive removing racism from their schools and universities, and denouncing it specifically on words and either revising mission statements or vision statements. But we also know that that's just a statement, right? Words, only words. So how can we change this to that we can move to the next step of actually requiring action? What actions are most needed to move forward as universities make these pronouncements of wanting to do something, but then taking that next step?
Yeah, thank you, Darlene. I think that's a really, really interesting and important question. The word commitment, we've used that word a lot. We're committed to change, we're committed to action, we're committed to justice, we're committed to equity, and it's really, really easy to say we are committed. The important part of your question about action is the hard part. The difficult part is turning that commitment into something that's real, into something that's accessible, into something that asks people to bring something of themselves other than some words or phrases. The way that I like to think about our commitment to action is to think about belonging. We want to put together action steps that will help our students and others, staff, faculty, and otherwise, feel like they belong on campus. We want folks to feel represented. We want them to see themselves in the curriculum, classroom, hidden and otherwise. We want them to see themselves in the faculty. We want Black students to see themselves in the staff as well. We want them to feel like the institution represents them. Our actions must keep those things in mind. We want our Black students to be validated. We want them to feel that there's a sense of respect for the questions that they bring into the classroom, for the knowledge that is foundational to those questions, and for the ways of being that our students bring to the classrooms that they use to answer those questions. We want them to feel, I think that our feeling validated, helping students feel validated is another important aspect of that action steps. We want folks to feel affirmed. We want to use methods of feedbacks that both remind Black students about, remind them that their potential and possibilities are real to us. And those things that guide their learning in the terms of building new knowledge in the classroom and in other places, that we affirm those things. And I want to thank my fellow panelist, Darnell, for reminding me about the idea of mattering. Action requires that people feel like they matter. And to get a little bit more, just a bit more specific, particular action steps that I want to see happen in my campus that we're working on right now. There's a few. First thing we want to start with is acknowledging. We have to acknowledge and respond to the things like the post that we see in the Black at USC or even the Black at Whittier Instagram account. And Action requires that you acknowledge that something is wrong. Sometimes we say we're committed to change, and we do that without saying what we're thinking about changing or what we're responding to. And there are everyday incidents of bias, microaggressions, and historical legacies that we have to acknowledge and respond to. A second action step is around recruitment and retention. We want to develop a comprehensive strategy that fits the institutional values that will help us recruit Black students, staff, and faculty, and to retain them once they end up at the institution. A third action step is education. We want to educate or train students, staff, and faculty so that they have a better understanding of the experience of Black folks on campus and how to change our own ways of being in such a way that folks feel like they matter, to go back to that phrase. In total, we want to take action steps that create a culture that intellectually amplifies Black traditions, Black histories, and Black ways of being, so that folks feel that strong sense of belonging and know that they matter on our campus. Darlene, I think you're muted.
This question, yeah, I just unmuted myself. I have to remember that. Thank you, Bruce. When Michele spoke earlier about the Eurocentric, whiteness that permeates universities like USC and others as well, and then how do you then bring what Bruce said, a sense of belonging? And that begins in the classroom, right? So the question for you, Darnell, is as a faculty member and a researcher, how does the classroom experience and student to faculty interactions on our campuses create barriers to removing racism?
Thank you, Darlene, for that question. And I'd like to give a nod to Michele and Bruce for helping to round out today's conversation so far. I think one of the things I'd like to add with regard to the teaching-learning relationship and the kind of pedagogical experience that students are likely to have in class is to remind us to recenter one of the critical heartbeats of an academic institution, which is the kind of pedagogical relationship that's established in that academic space. And if we know, we look back and we all have cited the literature, have read about it, have thought about the way in which the pedagogical relationship works, is a critical relationship between the instructor, the learning experience and exchange of the students with regard to the content of that classroom experience. And if we are going to tackle racism and institutional racism, there have to be several lifting factors that have to occur. And let me be a little bit more specific in terms of what I mean by that. I think that, and I'll give a short experience to communicate this. I've been talking to a lot of faculty colleagues about this experience, a pedagogical classroom experience. And one of the things that I hear very often from my white colleagues, very well-meaning faculty colleagues, and their heart is in the right place, is the sentiment around not being an expert on race and racism. Let me say that being an expert on race and racism is a good thing. And we all have a perspective that we lend into that. But without reading and studying for multiple years, I get the point that they're trying to make. But I tell them they are an expert in their content, in their area of study. And if you claim expertise in your content, in your area of study, and you have not unearthed the critical kind of underbelly of your discipline, of your content, where whiteness, white supremacist ideals frame your content, and they frame it in such a way that people of color, particularly Blacks in particular, are viewed as abnormal. If you have not investigated and unearthed those perspectives and the way it informs your content, perhaps you're not yet at the expert level that you should be, particularly when you're teaching and working with students across the board. Now, this is not just for Black students. It is in particular for students of color and white students to have an experience that's ameliorated around lifting the kind of pedagogical experience. And that means for faculty is really interrogate their content. That is not just the curriculum. It's not just the books they assign, the articles and the writing assignments. It's the understanding of their disciplinary perspective that informs how we think, how we understand what the phenomena is that we're studying. and how it might be viewed from different perspectives around race, and particularly around Black folks. When you engage that with the learning experience that you have with students, I think what makes learning so exciting and the classroom experience so exciting is there is a co-construction in that learning experience between the individuals in class and the instructor around the content. And we have to lift that up in ways that really investigates how, why, when issues of racism, anti-Blackness inform that content, and how it informs deficit perspectives that's usually embedded in that content. And so I want to highlight, you can't validate what you don't believe, who you don't believe should be there. If you don't believe Black students should be in your class, you can't validate them well. If you don't believe Black students should be in your class, it's hard to make sure that they know that they matter to you. If you don't validate, if you don't believe Black students should be there, it's very hard to make them feel like they belong. And so that heartbeat of the classroom experience is critical. And I'll say this to you, and I'll leave my comment on this. We can no longer believe that faculty who are trained in an area of expertise is sufficient to put them in a classroom. It is not. They must be trained to teach in a way that they probably were not taught, for whom they probably were not taught. We must institute training that's part of the tenure review promotion process for all faculty. And it must be thoughtfully engaged and must be part of how one acquires a faculty position. Thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Darnell, because I think based on what Michele said earlier and Bruce as well, that's the first contact for students is that relationship with faculty and how important that is to be successful in your studies, is having that sense of belonging and that pedagogical training that I belong here and I'm validated as an acknowledgement, as Bruce said, and that it's not Eurocentric, as Michele said earlier, and that we have a lot to offer. So thank you. So now I have additional questions that I would like each of you to answer. And so I'm going to start with you, Michele, because you do have such a great institutional understanding of our students being the executive director of the Black Alumni Association. How does institutional memory and alumni experience impact a campus's ability to address systemic and institutional racism?
Thank you, Darlene. Well, you know, building from what Darnell was speaking about, the pedagogical experience in the classroom, you know, when you stretch that out beyond the classroom, you really are talking about how the importance of community illuminates the entire learning experience. And so community and how you belong within these communities absolutely matters to what you learn and how you develop. And, you know, the memories then of your student experience through these classrooms and then within your community are certainly the things that you are going to take with you when you leave, when you graduate and you do become alumni. And, you know, there's a lot of different ways to approach this particular question, but I think at the root of it is to remember that especially Black people, Black individuals who have gone through an experience of being isolated from the norms of communities on campuses will always remember that. You know, and these experiences now start creating memory, you know, that they're going to keep with them whenever they associate themselves, you know, to the institution. And you know, on the one hand, this is what is actually going to affect and impact their engagement back with the institution. And there's some things, you know, that obviously, you know, stand tall over in this conversation, you know, especially when an institution now needs something from them, whether it's volunteerism or philanthropy. But it also, on the other side, just at the individual side, you know, really is amplified in terms of, you know, your circle of friends, your circle of people who helped you get through that institution are going to be your circle that you're going to continue to carry through the rest of your life. I know I did. My husband, my children, my friends that I graduated with we may still be very, very close, and we may have built our businesses together, raised our children together, but we didn't need the university for that. And we certainly did not connect back to the university for that in the same ways that white alumni are able to do. You know, so the institutional memory is real, and I think that it should be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement, I think, is a very important piece in terms of rebuilding community on these campuses. Darlene, you're muted.
Here, I'm the moderator and I need help from the panelists. Thank you for reminding me. As I was saying, those institutional memories are very strong, and then how we have to navigate those as strategies to navigate this. Bruce, you would like to add to this question as well?
Yeah, this is a thing that I've been talking at least a little bit with my dean and a faculty colleague at Whittier, Sal Johnston, and we talk about historical legacies. And we talk about it in a broad sense, but I think you can make it local as well. And in terms of historical legacy at a place like Whittier, you know, I think it's necessary for us at our institution, for those at other institutions, to acknowledge out loud that these institutions weren't made for the diverse communities that populate them right now. So historically, Whittier is a predominantly white institution right now. We are designated as an HSI, as Hispanic Serving Institution. And I think we have to be able to interrogate that history and how that happened, and whether it was strategic or not, and then what we're going to do strategically from here forward on, especially as it relates to the Black students who are on our campus right now. Being accidentally diverse isn't always a great thing, right? And we have to, that calls on us to develop some strategies for how we're going to deal with that history, interrogate that history, learn from that history, and build ways of being on our campus that reflect our commitment to, there's that word again, our commitment to the entire student population that we have in our institution now.
Darlene, can I add just a couple of things to that as well? You know, because I think the
Yes,
word
please.
Acknowledgement is something that gets overused, you know, especially in these conversations about how we move forward in this diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. You know, the experiences that people are attaching to right now, whether they are Instagram or not, these are the current experiences. But I will tell you, probably one of the most painful parts of my job, you know, is when I meet this amazing, extremely accomplished Black alum, and I have the opportunity to sit with them, especially, you know, as they're older, long retired, you know, it's an opportunity to, you know, kind of share some wisdom and things like this. And I've had more than opportunities on this hand where people in these conversations have absolutely broken down, you know, because for all of their accomplishment, they are not valued at the level that they should be valued by their university, you know, and they see other people, white alumni, who are valued for so much less and cared about so much more, you know, and yet we go to these same people now because of their fame or their accolades or the need to connect a thread to them from this university and ask of them, and do not understand that because we didn't create community or value them or weave them into the thread of the history of the institution, you know, that they have suffered, you know, and no one says anything about that. And in fact, there's no way to bring that forward, you know, and those are the days when I go home and I honestly, you know, think about how do I come back, you know, to do this work, you know, because now I have this piece of this person with me and I have to live with how do I do the right thing and move this conversation forward so that our children do not suffer in this way. So, I mean, these are very deep, very pain-felt conversations that are 50 years old, not just in an IG right now.
I think having that understanding today may be the moment that we're in, but that's a long history that we have to acknowledge from, as you said, weaving that thread intentionally, not as an afterthought. Thank you, Michele. Darnell, would you like to add to this question?
It's not much I can add. I'll just highlight a couple of things that I think are important is that the seamlessness between what we consider to be a classroom experience and outside of the classroom experience that both Michele and Bruce have highlighted is essential to transforming the institution to live up to its mission and its commitments. And we are better for it when we do it well. We are all better for it when we do it well. And while the focus is on Black folks today, you know, everyone has a turn. And I think when we lift up Black folks, we all are lifted up. And when we're able to do that, and the commitment should follow the action. The commitment often precedes the action, but the commitment should follow the action. When you are committed to doing the right thing, your actions should already show that. And one of the challenges I think institutions have to face is that they have actions that show commitments that run against what we're talking about today. And they need to change critical behaviors, critical policies in order to claim these new commitments.
It's again, Darnell, what you're talking about, you know, the evidence should be there first to say you're committed versus the reverse. Thank you. The next question I'd like to ask each of the panelists is, how can we work towards that? What will we begin to start creating a campus culture that truly does give our Black students that sense of belonging and that they matter? What can we do more specifically with this? I'm very phrase it later on in another question too, but for right now, how can we work towards creating that campus culture? And you spoke a little bit about it, Bruce, so I'm going to go to you and then to our other panelists.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is listen. We have to listen to our students, we have to listen to our staff and our faculty as well. The Black folks in our community have to be heard. And we have to listen with intention, not just to hear, for example, the stories that Michele's talking about. We have to listen with an eye towards some action. One of the things that we talk about at Whittier right now is that, you know, we've got a bunch of data, and a bunch of data that's collected somewhere. Now we don't collect them in files, we collect them on our computers, is meaningless, right? And what we're doing when we're listening is that we're collecting data, and then we have to act on it. So I think the first step is to hear people's stories, to take them seriously, and to listen to them with intention.
Darnell?
I'll add really fast. And I think that, you know, one of the missteps that has often taken place is that over the number of years that I've been at my current institution, which is about 14 years, it's hard to believe. You know, I'm such a young person. I started when I was really, really young, but I've been here 14 years, and I've sat on several listening commissions and task force. And one of the things I will say is that when there's no feedback, no follow up with the people you spoke to and you had issues to address, and you didn't have substantive follow up and a period for which they're listening to you talk about the challenges with changing policy or changing curriculum or changing behavior, it's a different kind of listening session. What I think have been missed is that that accountability to talk back to the people who you talk to about the data you collected, the perspectives you collected, to inform what things they recommend that should be changed. And the reason why we're talking about this 50 years later, 10 years later is, and not, when we say not much has changed, is because when you go back and look at those task force and those findings over the years, you will find probably, my guess is, more than 50% of the issues that were identified 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago are still in existence. It's because there were no feedback mechanisms and no accountability loops to come back to address those issues with the people, with the students, staff, and faculty, all of the critical constituents, the alum who matter to the institution and for whom the institution matters. And I think that is an important element that we now must step into and be accountable for.
I think
Thank you, Darnell. Go ahead, Michelle.
I'm sorry, Darlene. I think I would prefer, honestly, at this point, that people don't come into any committee or on any commissions if they are not, to use Bruce's word, committed to serve. I think that, you know, there has to, in order for there to be the change that we need to see, people have to bring a different lens into this work. They need to bring the lens of being what our colleague Sean Harper calls a racial realist, that person that acknowledges that there are discrepancies because of race. You can't come into these committees and have, you know, the other people who are already in this mode willing to roll up sleeves and do this work and then turn around and educate you. If you don't have the commitment to serve, you know, with regard to the objective of creating educational spaces as equalizing spaces, you know, to uplift the mobility of Black people, then don't come into the committee is probably the first piece of advice that I would give you. The second would be to make sure you come in with a racial realist lens, because it is critically needed in order to do this work, to serve. And as you all know, one of my very favorite sayings is, you can't serve the people if you don't love the people. So if you can't come into this work, don't, you know, have that little talk with yourself. Because I think that we're in this moment where people understand the choices that they need to make in order to create transformative change, the kind of change that creates different thought and thought leadership, not just building community and building safe spaces, but where do we go from here? And the work is difficult, but it's not difficult with the right lens, you know, for a change. And so I think some of my frustration has been, you know, people get to come into this work and get a pass for saying that they've served on these committees when they didn't bring the right level of commitment with them. And, you know, it's difficult when you're really trying to have the kind of agency that is impactful and powerful enough to take the findings to the next level, you know. So I think that, you know, we need to get past conversations where people now need to be overeducated about racism. Go educate yourself. I may not have been the expert, let's just say, this false narrative. I'm not an expert on what the Holocaust was about because I am not Jewish, but I darn sure, you know, have made sure that I am empathetic in this space, that I educate myself about this space, that if I say that I'm going to come into this space to uplift those who've been impacted by it, that I'm bringing my best self. And so I think that we have to insist that these are the people that come in to do this work. And, you know, when you look at the why of what we're really doing for Black students in the space of education, if you can't serve their mobility in a different manner now throughout society, why are you here? And I think that has to act, you know, we're at that point now, you know, of demanding answers about how you serve in these spaces for change.
So I'm going to go off my script and ask this question. How then, Michelle, I think it's an excellent point that you make, that, you know, you have to love the people, love the service and why we're here, and love the people that you want to serve. So how would an organization determine that X person is there really to serve? And how are they selected to be on these committees and commissions? What advice do you give to organizations that want to do that, but to making sure you have the right people with the right lens, that racial lens that we want them to have, and that they've demonstrated that commitment that they're there to serve, not to just have something on their vita or their resume or something that they're there. So I'd like to just hear who would like to start with that, because that's a question I would personally want to know, and I hope the audience would too, because I think as leaders, we're going to be in many situations, we're going to form these commissions, these committees, or look back, and we want to say, well, that didn't work, as you said, Darnell, we didn't do the follow-up and backtrack and close the loop, so to speak. So now I'm going to start anew. How do I make sure I do it right this time as a leader?
Mm-hmm.
Who would like to start now? Who would like to start? Michele?
I'm happy to say something very short on this. I think leadership matters. I've always thought that. And so I actually myself, I judge anything that I'm involved with by who that leader is and what I know that they stand for. And then as a leader myself, I do the work to make sure that people know exactly what I do stand for and that I'm authentic in that space. And some people may think that's courageous. I think it is, business as usual. And I really do believe that leadership matters in the sense of setting the example of values and culture, for what you want to bring people into the world, your space to do. And I, lift up my organization, USC Black Alumni Association, shout out to everybody that's on this call, because these are the same, like-minded kind of individuals that we have in this organization. And I know that I don't have to be the only voice, in fostering advocacy for change. They can all do it just as well as I can, but I think that it's easy when you know who the leader is and what they stand for, rather than being a person on a committee and having to shape that platform for the leader. Makes no sense in this conversation anyway. I'll hand it over.
Point. Good point. Darnell?
Yeah, I'll make 2 points to this. One is it goes back to something I just mentioned. When the behavior is there prior to the need, you already know people who are committed to this. It's no wonder that I see Michele on these panels all the time, and I just now meeting Bruce, but clearly he's already been identified as a critical contributor because of past behaviors. Not that people can't establish new commitments and new behaviors, but one of the things you want to be able to do is identify the people who are already committed to this work before you ask them to commit to the work. So that's one point I'd like to make. The other thing that happens is when people are committed to the work, they're overtaxed because they're always asked to do and speak on, to address and serve on panels. And typically that's not a bad thing because the people want to engage in their commitments. They want to do what they're good at. They want to contribute. They want to serve. But we often incentivize the behaviors we want to see in people. And we do it in the workplace in particular. And they have multiple modes of doing that, whether it's promotion, whether it's tenure, whether it's accolades within the space. But people often who serve on these kinds of committees and task force goes unrecognized. Now, it might be a line on your CV, but if that's the best you can offer, it's probably not good enough. And I'm not suggesting that we always pay people for their time, but we do want to recognize and value the time in ways where it's not marginalized, which again speaks to the overarching issue that we're trying to address. Every time I publish an article or I get a $500,000, $1 million grant, it's all over the place. As people are talking, they're promoting it. It makes me feel great. It goes in my tenure file. Oh, it's just wonderful. Oh, I don't mind that. I love it. But part of the problem is that when I do this kind of work, it's buried. Mm-hmm. The people who recognize it are the people who are attending today, the people who asked. Lift it up, value it in the ways that other things are valued. And then the kind of commitments you'll see an institution transform. If you put this as one of the promotion issues, one of the tenure issues, one of the necessary functions of the institution that, as an individual staff member, faculty, or student must engage in, you will see a change in behavior. And I will offer that as a way to think about when we talk about value, it's not just one of morality or ethics. It's one where you have to put your intentions, your resources, and your support behind what you value. This is what changes it from something you say as a commitment to something you do. And I'll leave my comment there.
Bruce, would you like to add?
Yeah, I just
some
really
comments here?
briefly, I want to second what Darnell said and what Michelle said. That's the first part. The second part is that at Whittier in my division, we like to say that our work is 100% relational. We build relationships with students and other folks on campus, and you can tell who the folks are who are willing to build those strong relationships, especially with the students who, because of race, are the most marginalized on your campus. The ones who reach out. I think those are the doers that the folks who are committed that both Darnell and Michelle are talking about, and they're easily identifiable. Darnell is right. The black tax is real. That's a real thing. We have to be really careful about that. And I know, at least in my experience, there are a number of people who think it's their responsibility to pay that tax a lot, right? And we have to be careful about asking people to do that thing. And at the same time, we know the folks who have demonstrated through past actions, who are willing to build strong relationships with Black students and are willing, and this is something I think we'll probably get to a little later, are willing to be called out, who are willing to be wrong, who are willing to demonstrate that they're growing on an everyday basis as well. And those are the folks I think that we want to identify for being on these task force and committees, so that those groups can actually do something as opposed to just collecting data that'll sit on the shelf.
Thank you. I hope all the leaders who are listening and viewing this recording or viewing it right now, as leaders, there's some good advice about how we can create the right people to be committed to this work and invite them to it. So I have one final question for the panelists before we go to the questions from the audience. And this one is, a few of you mentioned this, but what are the specific resources you recommend to help people understand the issues around racism and how they can be part of the solution? Anybody want to take a first? I've called it, but does anybody have just unmute if you want to go first, or I can just call? Darnell.
Go ahead, Darnell.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Michelle, please. I want to.
Well, in terms of resources, I like to mix a little bit of research, literature, and some things that you could do. I think first, once you commit, I guess, to go outside of your comfort zone. If I were to tell you, because people always ask me, well, what television show should I watch? What movie should I watch? And I'm a reader, so I'm like, well, you could read too, but a great series right now that you can download on Netflix, When They See Us by Ava DuVernay, would be probably a great place for you to really start to understand how the perceptions of white privilege can absolutely take the life away of Black young male individuals, especially just because you don't see them as human. And if you need that kind of primer, I would start there. The other is, to just, start talking to people. As Bruce said, everything is relational, and at the core of really creating change is to change some of your relationships and decide that you're open to new relationships. Friendship is a great thing. Finding a reason to have lunch or dinner with someone that you don't know to find out about who they are as human beings would be a great path to put yourself on, because I think when we start to develop relationships instead of just causes, so many things can just be organic. And to me, that really strikes at the core of it. Just like on the business side, we say people do business with people that they like. Well, I think it's very important in the work of diversity change that people do this work because they care about people as individuals. So, there could be probably a lot of different things that you could do to self-educate, but you, at the end of the day, have to care.
Thank you, Michelle. Darnell, and then we'll go to Bruce.
I appreciate this question always. And what makes the question like this difficult is that the context for engaging in the kind of resources can be vast when you're looking at this. I want to echo Michelle's point, you know, that it's a critical kind of work that's done, easily available on Netflix, and Ava's been known to really deep dive on this topic. If you follow Twitter, one of our past students, Victoria Alexander, tweeted out a list of resources that I think is helpful. She identifies kind of an anti-racist starter kit that includes Kindi's work. And she also highlights some intermediate anti-racist literature from, you know, Michelle Alexander's work on the new Jim Crow, and then some more expertise and specialized topics that I think you would find interesting in terms of reading. So I would implore you to go to her Twitter feed, and she identifies, again, a deep literature base. There are also many others. One of the other things I'll highlight is that you have to do this well and to think about it. You can't just pick one read or one show. It doesn't really work like that. You must begin to change and adapt multiple perspectives. And this is part of when I talk to colleagues, I talk to students, and you know, even amongst my friends, we have this kind of dialogue. You know, what should I read? What should I do? And it's hard to identify one place and one resource, because it's not one place and one resource. There are multiple ones. And what I talk about changing perspective is that you must now adapt the lens where race, racism, anti-Blackness is a critical part of how you become to see the world. And as a result of that, your interests will become more inclusive. And so when you start to read any history book, what's the critique of that history book that identifies the omitted peoples? So what I'm talking about is perspective. That perspective will help shape what resources, what materials, when you're watching a show and documentaries on Netflix, if you're getting one perspective, you always ask yourself, what is missing? And then find that and look for that. And again, there are a lot of resources. We're putting together something on our center's website that's going to include Victoria Alexander's list, so that it will be easily accessible. It's something that we should have up in a couple of weeks. We'll have a link that connects to her work. Again, it's a lot of reading materials, from everything from Carter G. Woodson's work to Du Bois's work. That's the kind of early framing of how we think about these topics, to everything to Kindi's work now. So sorry, I couldn't be that much more specific, but it's vast in terms of issues that we might look into. Again, we're going to have something on our website soon for the Center for Education, Identity, and Social Justice that will have several links that you can click onto. And I'll make sure this the panel, everyone on the panel, as well as the organizing body, will have that and can send it out to you.
Thank you, Darnell. Bruce?
Yeah, just a couple things. One, I'll put a plug in for a book that Darnell just mentioned. Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro is vital. It's decades old and it's ever relevant, always relevant. So I think that's a really interesting place to start. A few years ago, when I was at Reed College and we were mired in student activism, mired is probably the wrong word, but there was a bunch of student activism on campus. I read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And that book changed a lot of my perspective around the ideas of bringing compassion and empathy to the relationship work that we do. Those two concepts are really important in terms of fighting anti-Blackness and being anti-racist. I don't know that we can do this work if we didn't have compassion for people's experiences. We couldn't do what we can to put ourselves in other people's shoes to better understand who they are and where they want to be. And Stevenson's book, the book first, then the movie, but Stevenson's book, I think, is really, really vital for that conversation.
And if you want to be
you.
brave, let me just add a couple to the reading list. If you want to be brave, because these books absolutely lift up things in a very rational, thoughtful way. But if you want to be brave and really understand the experience, you know, read the autobiography of Malcolm X, one of the greatest leadership books out there. Read it. Read The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, who there is not a better author to speak about the platform for civil rights. And, you know, these are the things that, you know, once you get past, you know, thoughtful, oh, now I understand, read for the experience so that you can start to become, I guess, more expert in terms of what the why behind frustrations, you know. So if you want to become even more empathetic and more closely aligned, those would be two good ones to add.
Just a quick note, I did on Twitter, I did retweet Victoria Alexander's, the actual tweet that has the list attached to it. And so you can follow that on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll see that I just retweeted that out. Darnell G. Cole on Twitter. Thanks.
Thank you for those thoughtful suggestions and resources. And I think, again, going back to earlier, we own that. We need to do that. We have to do the work. And we have to be reminded that we have to individually do the work. So thank you for getting this started. I'm now going to turn to the audience for their questions. We have a few that I want to bring forward. And I'll, again, just maybe let me know who wants to listen.
Uh-oh. Darlene, you're muted.
I think she turned off her recorder.
Darlene, come back. Does she know?
Not yet. Now you're muted. Now you're not.
Okay, so
There we go.
okay, so the question, and I apologize for that, was from one that said, what do we do with faculty who we inherit, who are entrenched and have no interest in learning or are open to the issues that we're talking about today?
Okay, so Darnell and Bruce might have to be politically correct, but can I just start this and then they can be correct about it? You know, I think that, again, you know, back to my comments about leadership matters, you know, policy frameworks are not set in stone. And if we are to move to a multicultural policy framework in institutions like ours, there might need to be some retweaking of what tenure actually means and what faculty contracts actually mean. Because, you know, as I was sharing with a group yesterday, diversity is not a task. It has to be forefront in the culture of the institutions. That's what the moment that we're in calls for. So I think that there has to be an examination of how diversity, this lens, impacts everything attached to the university, including employment contracts, to include faculty contracts. So I will say that.
Let's see if I can be politically correct a little bit. There's an old concept, particularly among faculty, that we used to use, and we used to say dead wood. And what we meant by that, that they used to talk about in faculty life, is people who have decided that publishing and research is no longer their focal point, and teaching is something that they're no longer going to revise. Such that, you know, when I was in college, I still had, you know, those mimeograph copies with the purple ink that no one had changed in they hadn't changed their course in the last 10 years. That's dead wood. And what the institution did was they started to put things in place to one, identify that dead wood faculty, those who are not going to be engaged in their practice, are not going to be promoted. They're not going to get the accolades They're not going to get merit, and they're going to be counseled to think about early retirement. And that's what happened. Now, I'm not sure about the legal ramifications of that kind of practice, but what I'm suggesting is that there were institutional mechanisms that were put in place to revitalize the faculty, in particular, those who were engaged in the active pursuit of the institution's mission, which was one, to do research, to do teaching, to do service, and essentially now is to do and write grants. And so you have seen this shift over the last 10 to 15 years that has been accelerated because of the kind of business-like model that institutions have adapted. And so if we're thinking about institutional survival, I think shifting the mechanisms that provide the incentives for faculty to get a job, to be in that job and be successful in that job, now must include things that we have been talking about and that we're talking about here today. Is, do you spend time talking and getting to know the students that work with you, that are in your classes? Do you serve them well? Do you provide support to the institution around your areas of expertise and areas that we are committed to? Do you think about changing your curriculum? Do you actually change your curriculum? Do you actually meet the needs of the students in your classes? Now, the schools that have figured this out are the ones that are always on the brink of financial collapse. They have figured out if we don't cater to our population, our constituents, we are not going to survive. And all hands on deck. Now, all hands on deck don't mean everybody's going to play by the same rules. And we can't decide that we're not going to move forward because of a few people who are not going to engage in diversity, anti-Blackness work, critical thought, and their expertise. But we can help them find their ways out of the institution. And that's been going on for years. Now, I'm sorry, that last part wasn't that politically correct, but if you're going to talk about institutional transformation, we got to have the most important conversation. You're not going to be, for example, at USC, a research institution if you don't have faculty and students and staff engaging in research. You're not going to be an institution that promotes democracy, develops citizenry in today's age with a diverse citizenry if you don't do that. So, critical that institutions must think about how they're going to put value and merit and teeth behind these commitments. That's what I'll offer up.
I think that's absolutely right, Darnell. And to speak to the last part, there are faculty, and I've had conversations with them, who don't think that it's the job of the university, the college, to create citizens prepared for a global, diverse democracy. They think it's their job to I don't know, transform or transmit knowledge, right? And I don't know whether it's politically correct or not, but I can frame it this way: as a dean of students, it's my job to advocate for students quite often, and I could say that I've had, I would guess I could call it a confrontational conversation with a faculty member or two, while advocating for Black students about the ways those faculty interact with those Black students. So next time I have that conversation will not be the first time that I have that conversation. So I think that has to happen on some level. And I think the institutional systems and structures that Darnell and Michele are talking about, that's probably the most important part of this. That the institutions have to be able to demonstrate their commitment by adjusting their systems and structures in the ways that they recruit, retain, promote, grant tenure, all of those things when it comes to faculty.
May I add one more thing? You know, I think that it would be kind of arrogant for, given this moment, for people to think that the way they did things before is the way that they can continue to keep doing things. I mean, we are in a moment where we're understanding that very hierarchical old legacy systems can be reformed, because that, you know, can happen when your collective voice somehow finds the ability to influence. And we are absolutely seeing that. Just look at how the issue of police reform is starting to evolve. You know, I think if there is no response adequately to how we create a multicultural policy framework in institutions, educational institutions, that what will follow that will be a collective voice about institutional policy reform, specifically at the faculty level. And then I just want to add one last thing with regard to what Darnell was saying. It's great to posit all of these requirements, but to also close that loop with a feedback loop that, you can be able to discern whether or not this particular faculty member caused harm. We can't have faculty in our classrooms that cause emotional harm. And, there's enough research that has been done, overstudied, about the fact that our Black students are often traumatized. That's harm. So if there is a checkbox from a faculty evaluation that said this faculty member caused me harm, then that should be enough then, to make different decisions about their contract going forward. So we can do this a number of different legal ways. How do you want to do it? But I'll find you on this continuum the way that I can to keep you accountable.
Thank you. So I'm going to end with one final question that I'd like all of you to respond to. Is, again, we've covered a lot of great information, and I think also the awareness level that there's so much work still to do, and that we have to hold ourselves accountable, the institutions we work for, to really make a difference. If not, we don't want to be here, not me, but others 50 years from now still having this conversation, because that would be the not taking our role seriously and moving forward on behalf of our Black students and community. So we'd like to now know if you could give us some actionable steps, personal steps. We've talked a lot about what the organizations need to do and how we have to do that. But if we're looking at individuals, close to 200 individuals today, that we could take tomorrow, try tomorrow, let's say, what could we take from here? We could begin to disrupt, remove racism, aspirational dream, but at least disrupt it from our campus communities. What would be some actionable steps that I and others that are listening today can take immediately, or maybe not tomorrow, but within the future, when maybe we have some courses, but we start in the fall, to really disrupt racism in our campuses?
I think I'll start. One of the things that I've come to realize, at least over the last few years, I go into classrooms, I go into, I meet with students, and for a long, long time, I consider myself the most progressive person in the room. And I've learned over the last few years that that is not true. I have so much to learn from my students. And I think we all have these moments when we realize, Darnell used the word expert before, and that we're not experts. And to me, I think, I don't know if I necessarily would call it an actionable step, but it's a thing that I think we all have to realize is that we need to be humble. A dose of humility goes a long way in, one, the building of relationships with our students, and two, our ability to listen to them with empathy and compassion, as I talked about before. The thing that I want to do every day is come into my interactions with folks with that bit of humility, and the acknowledgement that I have a lot to learn and I am not as progressive as I might like to pretend to be.
I think I would offer for people, if they need a step, I would offer that the best step is to commit to yourself to be a better person, in terms of how you care about the other person. I just don't think that this is rocket science. There's nothing in my being that believes that overcoming racism is rocket science. But what I do know from my own lived experiences, that it is a matter of choice. And I'm very comfortable, saying this. I'm a biracial woman. I've grown up in both a white household and a Black household, both households who loved me, who valued me, and who affirmed me. But I also know that these individuals, were very aware of their personhood, and the fact that they could make the choices, to be people who could really invest in the other person's humanity was the biggest life lesson I ever received. And, you know, because I know it's possible, I offer to other people, this is possible if you make that choice. And so I would offer, make the choice. You know, your life just might be better for it. And you might be, you know, able to actually bless people in your living because of what you've brought up to this point and how you change beyond this point.
I'll highlight maybe one or two things. There's a documentary on Netflix that's about James Baldwin. And if you haven't read James Baldwin's work or seen any of his interviews, I would highly recommend it. In that work, he talked about this notion between a public stance and private lives. And I think one of the critical areas that you might be able to consider is closing the gap between your public stance on these very important issues in your private lives. How you live your day-to-day life speak to the level of authenticity, the level of trust you're able to establish with not only Black students, Black people, Black folks, but also how you think and construct those issues that matter to you. If your public life has nothing to do with this, it's going to be really hard to kind of make the strides that you talk about in a public stance. One of the things you might be able to do, particularly if you're a faculty member, is to take on an initiative, a behavioral change in your curriculum that is a deep investigation of how do you ameliorate that curriculum to speak to the issues that we're talking about today: anti-Blackness, racism, institutional racism. If you don't take on the curricular challenge, take on the pedagogical challenge. How do I engage in what were once considered taboo topics, which are today everyday topics? How do I take this on in my class? And if I can't facilitate, how do I learn how to facilitate dialogue that decenters me and my perspective to one that facilitates a conversation, a growth point? How do I learn how to do that? I'm not saying don't harm students. Don't put them in a position where they're doing the teaching in your classroom. I'm talking about how do I learn how to facilitate these conversations in useful ways? Look for those opportunities to learn. If you don't want to do the curricular challenge and you don't want to do the pedagogical challenge, then take on a challenge when you're talking and working with students so that they feel validated, so that they understand the academic self-efficacy that you promote in learning, that they're part of that. They feel like they belong and they know that they matter. Take on that challenge and figure it out. You don't have to do all of these at once. It's hard. I will admit it's really difficult work if you've never done it before. But if you commit to doing one, I guarantee it's going to lead to the others.
I am, again, so honored to have been here moderating the three of you amazing individuals to give us guidance and hope that we can do it and give us some actual steps and things to work on beginning tomorrow. As you said, be humble, have a sense of belonging, know our history, learn the history, be empathetic, be committed, be willing to serve, and be your authentic self. And I think those lessons can be used for all of us in any situation, but more so as we really want to disrupt racism on campus and support our students, specifically our Black students, to feel that they belong here, period, but that they get that sense for everybody that's with them. So thank you on behalf of our Leadership Month and everyone here for spending your time, being generous with your time and comments, so that we all leave here doing better tomorrow. And getting to know ourselves. So with that, again, I wish I could do the applause and the thing, but I'll just applaud right now for everybody here that can on the webinar. Again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure getting to know all of you more deeply and getting to know your strong commitment to making a difference in our students' lives and reducing, disrupting racism on our campuses. So now I'll turn it over to Matt for the closure.
I would like to take this opportunity. Thank you, Darlene. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists and our moderator for providing this valuable insight. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of today's webinar will be sent out in the next few days. When you close out today's seminar, a short survey will appear. Please take a moment to provide feedback on today's webinar and share your ideas for future virtual programs. Don't forget to tag us on social media at Rossier Leads. And thank you for attending. We hope you will attend future Leadership Month sessions. Have a great day and fight on.